8. Then everybody began planning a tremendous trek to the mountains. This started in the morning, together with a phone call that complicated matters. My old road friend Eddie, who took a blind chance and called. He remembered some of the names I had mentioned. Now I had the opportunity to get my shirt back. Eddie was with his girl in a house off Colfax. He wanted to know if I knew where to find work, and I told him to come over, figuring Dean would know. Dean arrived, hurrying, while Major and I were having a hasty breakfast. Dean wouldn't even sit down. I have 1,000 things to do. In fact, hardly any time to take you down Camargo, but let's go, man. Wait for my road buddy Eddie. Major found our hurrying troubles amusing. He'd come to Denver to write leisurely. He treated Dean with extreme deference. Dean paid no attention. Major talked to Dean like this. Moriarty, what's this I hear about you sleeping with 3 girls at the same time? And Dean shuffled on the rug and said, oh yes, that's the way it goes, so. And looked at his watch, and Major snuffed down his nose. I felt sheepish rushing off with Dean. Major insisted he was a moron and a fool. Of course he wasn't, and I wanted to prove it to everybody somehow. We met Eddie. Dean paid no attention to him either, and off we went in a trolley across the hot Denver noon to find the jobs. I hated the thought of it. Eddie talked and talked the way he always did. We found a man in the markets who agreed to hire both of us. Work started at 4 o'clock in the morning and went till 6 p.m. The man said, I like boys who like to work. You've got your man, said Eddie, but I wasn't so sure about myself. I just won't sleep, I decided. There were so many other interesting things to do. Eddie showed up the next morning. I didn't. I had a bed, and Major bought food for the icebox, and in exchange for that I cooked and washed the dishes. Meantime, I got all involved in everything. A big party took place at the Rollinses one night. The Rollins mother was gone on a trip. Ray Rollins called everybody he knew and told them to bring whiskey. Then he went through his address book for girls. He made me do most of the talking. A whole bunch of girls showed up. I phoned Carlo to find out what Dean was doing now. Dean was coming to Carlo's at 3 in the morning. I went there after the party. Carlo's basement apartment was on Grant Street in an old red brick rooming house near a church. You went down an alley, down some stone steps, opened an old raw door, and went through a kind of cellar till you came to his board door. It was like the room of a Russian saint. One bed, a candle burning, stone walls that ooze moisture, and a crazy makeshift icon of some kind that he had made. He read me his poetry. It was called Denver Doldrums. Carlo woke up in the morning and heard the vulgar pigeons yakking in the street outside his cell. He saw the sad nightingales nodding on the branches, and they reminded him of his mother. A gray shroud fell over the city. The mountains, the magnificent Rockies that you can see to the west from any part of town, were papier-mâché. The whole universe was crazy and cockeyed and extremely strange. He wrote of Dean as a child of the rainbow, who bore his torment in his agonized Priapus. He referred to him as Oedipus Eddie, who had to scrape bubble gum off window panes. He brooded in his basement over a huge journal in which he was keeping track of everything that happened every day. Everything Dean did and said. Dean came on schedule. Everything's straight, he announced. I'm going to divorce Mary Lou and marry Camille and go live with her in San Francisco. But this is only after you and I, dear Carlo, go to Texas, dig old Bull Lee, that gone cat I've never met and both of you told me so much about, and then I'll go to San Fran. Then they got down to business. They sat on the bed cross-legged and looked straight at each other. I slouched in a nearby chair and saw all of it. They began with an abstract thought, discussed it, reminded each other of another abstract point forgotten in the rush of events. Dean apologized but promised he could get back to it and manage it fine, bringing up illustrations. Carlo said, and just as we were crossing Wizzy, I wanted to tell you about how I felt of your frenzy with the midgets. And it was just then, remember? You pointed out that old bum with the baggy pants and said he looked just like your father? Yes, of course I remember. And not only that, but it started a train of my own. Something real wild that I had to tell you. I'd forgotten it. Now you just reminded me of it. And 2 new points were born. They hashed these over. Then Carlo asked Dean if he was honest, and specifically if he was being honest with him in the bottom of his soul. Why do you bring that up again? There's one last thing I want to know. But, dear Sal, you're listening. You're sitting there. We'll ask Sal. What would he say? And I said, that last thing is what you can't get, Carlo? Nobody can get to that last thing? We keep on living in hopes of catching it once for all. No, you're talking absolute bullshit and wolfing romantic posh, said Carlo. And Dean said, I didn't mean that at all, but we'll let Sal have his own mind. And in fact, don't you think, Carlo, there's a kind of a dignity in the way he's sitting there and digging us? Crazy cat came all the way across the country. Old Sal won't tell, old Sal won't tell. It isn't that I won't tell, I protested. I just don't know what you're both driving at or trying to get at. I know it's too much for anybody. Everything you say is negative. Then what is it you're trying to do? Tell him. No, you tell him. There's nothing to tell, I said and laughed. I had on Carlo's hat. I pulled it down over my eyes. I want to sleep, I said. Poor Sal always wants to sleep. I kept quiet. They started in again. When you borrowed that nickel to make up the check for the chicken fried steaks. No, man, the chili, remember, the Texas Star? I was mixing it with Tuesday. When you borrowed that nickel, you said, now listen, you said, Carlo, this is the last time I'll impose on you? As if, and really, you meant that I had agreed with you about no more imposing. No, I didn't mean that. You hearken back now, if you will, my dear fellow, to the night Mary Lou was crying in the room, and when, turning to you and indicating by my extra added sincerity of tones, which we both knew was contrived but had its intention, that is, by my play acting, I showed that... But wait, that isn't it. Of course that isn't it, because you forget that, but I'll stop accusing you. Yes is what I said. And on. On into the night, they talked like this. At dawn, I looked up. They were tying up the last of the morning's matters. When I said to you that I had to sleep because of Mary Lou, that is, seeing her this morning at 10, I didn't bring my peremptory tone to bear in regard to what you just said about the unnecessariness of sleep, but only, mind you, because of the fact that I absolutely, simply, purely, and without any whatevers have to sleep now. I mean, man, my eyes are closing. They're red hot, sore, tired, beat. Ah, child, said Carlo. We'll just have to sleep now. Let's stop the machine. You can't stop the machine, yelled Carlo at the top of his voice. The first bird sang. Now when I raise my hand, said Dean, we'll stop talking, we'll both understand purely, and without any hassle, that we are simply stopping talking, and we'll just sleep. You can't stop the machine like that. Stop the machine, I said. They looked at me. He's been awake all this time, listening. What were you thinking, Sal? I told them that I was thinking they were very amazing maniacs, and that I had spent the whole night listening to them like a man watching the mechanism of a watch that reached clear to the top of Berthoud Pass, and yet was made with the smallest works of the most delicate watch in the world. They smiled. I pointed my finger at them and said, if you keep this up, you'll both go crazy, but let me know what happens as you go along. I walked out and took a trolley to my apartment, and Carlo Marx's papier-mâché mountains grew red as the great sun rose from the eastward plains. Nine. In the evening, I was involved in that trek to the mountains and didn't see Dean or Carlo for 5 days. Babe Rollins had the use of her employer's car for the weekend. We brought suits and hung them on the car windows and took off for Central City. Ray Rollins driving, Tim Gray lounging in the back, and Babe up front. It was my first view of the interior of the Rockies. Central City is an old mining town that was once called the richest square mile in the world, where a veritable shelf of silver had been found by the old buzzards who roamed the hills. They grew wealthy overnight, and had a beautiful little opera house built in the midst of their shacks on the steep slope. Lillian Russell had come there, and opera stars from Europe. Then Central City became a ghost town, till the energetic Chamber of Commerce types of the New West decided to revive the place. They polished up the opera house, and every summer stars from the Metropolitan came out and performed. It was a big vacation for everybody. Tourists came from everywhere, even Hollywood stars. We drove up the mountain and found the narrow streets chock full of Chi-Chi tourists. I thought of Major Sam, and Major was right. Major himself was there, turning on his big social smile to everybody and oohing and aahing most sincerely over everything. "Sal," he cried, clutching my arm. "Just look at this old town. Think how it was 100, well, what the hell, only 80, 60 years ago? They had opera." "Yeah," I said, imitating one of his characters, "but they're here." "The bastards," he cursed. But he went off to enjoy himself, Betty Gray on his arm. Babe Rollins was an enterprising blonde. She knew of an old miner's house at the edge of town where we boys could sleep for the weekend. All we had to do was clean it out. We could also throw vast parties there. It was an old shack of a thing covered with an inch of dust inside. It had a porch and a well in back. Tim Gray and Ray Rollins rolled up their sleeves and started in cleaning it, a major job that took them all afternoon and part of the night. But they had a bucket of beer bottles and everything was fine. As for me, I was scheduled to be a guest at the opera that afternoon, escorting Babe on my arm. I wore a suit of Tim's. Only a few days ago, I'd come into Denver like a bum. Now I was all racked up sharp in a suit, with a beautiful well-dressed blonde on my arm, bowing to dignitaries and chatting in the lobby under chandeliers. I wondered what Mississippi Gene would say if he could see me. The opera was Fidelio. "What gloom?" cried the baritone, rising out of the dungeon under a groaning stone. "I cried for it. That's how I see life, too. I was so interested in the opera that for a while I forgot the circumstances of my crazy life and got lost in the great mournful sounds of Beethoven and the rich Rembrandt tones of his story and Well, Sal, how did you like the production for this year?" As Denver D-Doll proudly in the street outside, he was connected with the Opera Association. "What gloom, what gloom," I said. "It's absolutely great. The next thing you'll have to do is meet the members of the cast." He went on in his official tones, but luckily he forgot this in the rush of other things and vanished. Babe and I went back to the miner's shack. I took off my duds and joined the boys in the cleaning. It was an enormous job. Roland Major sat in the middle of the front room that had already been cleaned and refused to help. On a little table in front of him, he had his bottle of beer and his glass. As we rushed around with buckets of water and brooms, he reminisced. If you could just come with me sometime and drink Cinzano and hear the musicians of Bandol, then you'd be living. Then there's Normandy in the summers, the Sabbats, the fine old Calvados. Come on, Sam, he said to his invisible pal. Take the wine out of the water, and let's see if it got cold enough while we fished. Straight out of Hemingway, it was. We called out to girls who went by in the street. "Come on, help us clean up the joint. Everybody's invited to our party tonight." They joined us. We had a huge crew working for us. Finally, the singers in the opera chorus, mostly young kids, came over and pitched in. The sun went down. Our day's work over, Tim Rollins and I decided to sharp up for the big night. We went across town to the rooming house where the opera stars were living. Across the night, we heard the beginning of the evening performance. "Just right," said Rollins. "Latch on to some of these razors and towels and we'll spruce up a bit." We also took hairbrushes, colognes, shaving lotions, and went laden into the bathroom. We all took baths and sang. "Isn't this great?" Tim Gray kept saying, using the opera star's bathroom and towels and shaving lotion and electric razors. It was a wonderful night. Central City's 2 miles high. At first you get drunk on the altitude, then you get tired, and there's a fever in your soul. We approached the lights around the opera house down the narrow, dark street. Then we took a sharp right and hit some old saloons with swinging doors. Most of the tourists were in the opera. We started off with a few extra-sized beers. There was a player piano. Beyond the back door was a view of mountain sides in the moonlight. I let out a yahoo. The night was on. We hurried back to our miner's shack. Everything was in preparation for the big party. The girls, Babe and Betty, cooked up a snack of beans and franks, and then we danced and started on the beer for fare. The opera over, great crowds of young girls came piling into our place. Rollins and Tim and I licked our lips. We grabbed them and danced. There was no music, just dancing. The place filled up, people began to bring bottles. We rushed out to hit the bars and rushed back. The night was getting more and more frantic. I wish Dean and Carlo were there. Then I realized they'd be out of place and unhappy. They were like the man with the dungeon stone and the gloom, rising from the underground, the sordid hipsters of America. A new beat generation that I was slowly joining. The boys from the chorus showed up. They began singing Sweet Adeline. They also sang phrases such as "Pass me the beer" and "What are you doing with your face hanging out?" and great long baritone howls of Fidelio. "Ah me, what gloom," I sang. The girls were terrific. They went out in the backyard and necked with us. There were beds in the other rooms, the unclean, dusty ones, and I had a girl sitting on one and was talking with her when suddenly there was a great inrush of young ushers from the opera, who just grabbed girls and kissed them without proper come-ons. Teenagers, drunk, disheveled, excited, so they ruined our party. Inside of 5 minutes, every single girl was gone, and a great big fraternity-type party got underway with banging of beer bottles and roars. Ray and Tim and I decided to hit the bars. Major was gone. Babe and Betty were gone. We tottered into the night. The opera crowd was jamming the bars from bar to wall. Major was shouting above heads. The eager, bespectacled Denver D-Doll was shaking hands with everybody and saying, "Good afternoon, how are you?" And when midnight came, he was saying, "Good afternoon, how are you?" At one point, I saw him going off somewhere with a dignitary. Then he came back with a middle-aged woman. Next minute, he was talking to a couple of young ushers in the street. The next minute, he was shaking my hand without recognizing me and saying, "Happy New Year, my boy." He wasn't drunk on liquor, just drunk on what he liked. Crowds of people milling. Everybody knew him. "Happy New Year," he called, and sometimes, "Merry Christmas." He said this all the time. At Christmas, he said Happy Halloween. There was a tenor in the bar who was highly respected by everyone. Denver Doll had insisted that I meet him, and I was trying to avoid it. His name was D'Annunzio, or some such thing. His wife was with him. They sat sourly at a table. There was also some kind of Argentinian tourist at the bar. Rollins gave him a shove to make room. He turned and snarled. Rollins handed me his glass and knocked him down on the brass rail with one punch. The man was momentarily out. There were screams. Tim and I scooted Rollins out. There was so much confusion the sheriff couldn't even thread his way through the crowd to find the victim. Nobody could identify Rollins. We went to other bars. Major staggered up a dark street. "What the hell's the matter? Any fights? Just call on me." Great laughter rang from all sides. I wondered what the spirit of the mountain was thinking, and looked up and saw jack pines in the moon, and saw ghosts of old miners, and wondered about it. In the whole eastern dark wall of the divide this night, there was silence and the whisper of the wind, except in the ravine where we roared. And on the other side of the divide was the great western slope, and the big plateau that went to Steamboat Springs, and dropped and led you to the western Colorado desert and the Utah desert. All in darkness now, as we fumed and screamed in our mountain nook, mad drunken Americans in the mighty land. We were on the roof of America, and all we could do was yell, I guess, across the night eastward over the plains, where somewhere an old man with white hair was probably walking towards us with the word, and would arrive any minute and make us silent. Rollins insisted on going back to the bar where he'd fought. Tim and I didn't like it, but stuck to him. He went up to D'Annunzio, the tenor, and threw a highball in his face. We dragged him out. A baritone singer from the chorus joined us, and we went to a regular Central City bar. Here, Ray called the waitress a whore. A group of sullen men were ranged along the bar. They hated tourists. One of them said, "You boys better be out of here by the count of 10. We were. We staggered back to the shack and went to sleep. In the morning, I woke up and turned over. A big cloud of dust rose from the mattress. I yanked at the window. It was nailed. Tim Gray was in the bed too. We coughed and sneezed. Our breakfast consisted of stale beer. Babe came back from her hotel and we got our things together to leave. Everything seemed to be collapsing. As we were going out to the car, Babe slipped and fell flat on her face. Poor girl was overwrought. Her brother and Tim and I helped her up. We got in the car. Major and Betty joined us. The sad ride back to Denver began. Suddenly we came down from the mountain and overlooked the great seaplain of Denver. Heat rose as from an oven. We began to sing songs. I was itching to get on to San Francisco. That night I found Carlo, and to my amazement, he told me he'd been in Central City with Dean. "What did you do?" "Oh, we ran around the bars, and then Dean stole a car, and we drove back down the mountain curves 90 miles an hour. I didn't see you." "We didn't know you were there." "Well, man, I'm going to San Francisco." Dina has Rita lined up for you tonight. Well then, I'll put it off. I had no money. I sent my aunt an airmail letter asking her for $50 and said it would be the last money I'd ask. After that, she would be getting money back from me as soon as I got that ship, and then I went to meet Rita Betancourt and took her back to the apartment. I got her in my bedroom after a long talk in the dark of the front room. She was a nice little girl, simple and true and tremendously frightened of sex. I told her it was beautiful. I wanted to prove this to her. She let me prove it, but I was too impatient and proved nothing. She sighed in the dark. What do you want out of life? I asked, and I used to ask that all the time of girls. I don't know, she said. Just wait on tables and try to get along. She yawned. I put my hand over her mouth and told her not to yawn. I tried to tell her how excited I was about life and the things we could do together, saying that and planning to leave Denver in 2 days. She turned away wearily. We lay on our backs, looking at the ceiling and wondering what God had wrought when he made life so sad. We made vague plans to meet in Frisco. My moments in Denver were coming to an end. I could feel it when I walked her home. On the way back, I stretched out on the grass of an old church with a bunch of hobos, and their talk made me want to get back on that road. Every now and then, one would get up and hit a passerby for a dime. They talked of harvests moving north. It was warm and soft. I wanted to go and get Rita again and tell her a lot more things, and really make love to her this time and calm her fears about men. Boys and girls in America have such a sad time together. Sophistication demands that they submit to sex immediately without proper preliminary talk. Not courting talk, real straight talk about souls, for life is holy and every moment is precious. I heard the Denver and Rio Grande locomotive howling off to the mountains. I wanted to pursue my star further. Major and I sat sadly talking in the midnight hours. Have you ever read Green Hills of Africa? It's Hemingway's best. We wished each other luck. We would meet in Frisco. One saw Rollins under a dark tree in the street. Goodbye, Ray. When do we meet again? I went to look for Carlo and Dean. Nowhere to be found. Tim Gray shot his hand up in the air and said, "So you're leaving, yo." We called each other yo. Yep, I said. The next few days I wandered around Denver. It seemed to me every bum on Larimer Street maybe was Dean Moriarty's father. Old Dean Moriarty, they called him, the tinsmith. I went in the Windsor Hotel, where father and son had lived, and where one night Dean was frightfully waked up by the legless man on the rollerboard who shared the room with them. He came thundering across the floor on his terrible wheels to touch the boy. I saw the little midget newspaper-selling woman with the short legs on the corner of Curtis and 15th. I walked around the sad honky-tonks of Curtis Street, young kids in jeans and red shirts, peanut shells, movie marquees, shooting parlors. Beyond the glittering street was darkness, and beyond the darkness, the west. I had to go. At dawn, I found Carlo. I read some of his enormous journal, slept there, and in the morning, drizzly and gray, tall 6-foot Ed Dunkel came in with Roy Johnson, a handsome kid, and Tom Snark, the club-footed pool shark. They sat around and listened with abashed smiles as Carlo Marx read them his apocalyptic mad poetry. I slumped in my chair, finished. "Oh, you Denver birds, and you multi teasing you like," cried Carlo. We all filed out and went up a typical cobbled Denver alley between incinerators, smoking slowly. "I used to roll my hoop up this alley," Chad King had told me. I wanted to see him do it. I wanted to see Denver 10 years ago when they were all children, and in the sunny cherry blossom morning of springtime in the Rockies rolling their hoops up the joyous alleys full of promise. The whole gang. And Dean, ragged and dirty, prowling by himself in his preoccupied frenzy. Roy Johnson and I walked in the drizzle. I went to Eddie's girl's house to get back my wool plaid shirt, the shirt of Shelton, Nebraska. It was there, all tied up, the whole enormous sadness of a shirt. Roy Johnson said he'd meet me in Frisco. Everybody was going to Frisco. I went and found my money had arrived. The sun came out and Tim Gray rode a trolley with me to the bus station. I bought my ticket to San Fran, spending half of the $50, and got on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Tim Gray waved goodbye. The bus rolled out of the storied, eager Denver streets. "By God, I gotta come back and see what else will happen," I promised. In a last-minute phone call, Dean said he and Carlo might join me on the coast. I pondered this and realized I hadn't talked to Dean for more than 5 minutes in the whole time.